Thank you. And without further ado, Nottingham University Business School, not Nottingham Business School. They're two different institutions. I wouldn't want to embarrass anybody. So it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce our three panel members who are going to address a set of questions which I put to them about the middle of yesterday. So I've given them a little bit of time to think about it. Moving from my left, Richard Howitt, member of the European Parliament and the CSR rapporteur in the European Parliament. Engelbert Schramm, head of research and co-founder of the Institute for Social and Ecological Research, and Bruce Hash, BH Consulting, and former head of Climate Business Engagement Unit at the World WWF, as we call it these days. So just a few brief introductory remarks, particularly from the societal perspective. As you'll have gathered from Regina, our research was motivated by a question really about CSR, and I think a slight perception that CSR, as conventionally understood, is impact light. And I think that obviously that assumption's been realised. In a sense, we probably think that if business is making a contribution to society, and it's talking about responsiveness, and it's engaging in stakeholder-oriented strategies, necessarily these impacts on society must be there and they must be positive. And we've somewhat conflated two important things which Regina distinguished in her presentation: outcomes and impacts. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Without wanting to anticipate the comments of our panel, from our findings, I've just drawn four possible future drivers of what we call impact mindfulness. In other words, an attitude in CSR which attends to thinking about impacts rather than just producing the outputs. And number one, the business case. And certainly in the academic literature, and I know also in the world of consultancies and companies, the phrase the business case is used widely. And presumably, if the business case is to be taken seriously, companies want to be able to align their financial investment in CSR with some sense of what it's generating. So you would have thought a business case taken seriously wouldn't simply be looking at the investment versus the company outputs, but looking at the social impacts. Secondly, the intrinsic evaluation. And again, our findings suggest that businesses do believe in CSR for its own sake, particularly the SMEs, as it happens. But again, if we think that CSR is valuable for its own sake, then presumably attending to understanding its impacts would be part of accountability. Thirdly, of course, there is a fear of societal skepticism and civil society interest in companies has been seen as one of the drivers of CSR. We've moved from one critique of window dressing of Milton Friedman to the more recent greenwashing. And of course, I think it's worth noting here that civil society isn't just interested in CSR, it's interested in corporations. It's interested in what corporations' impact is. And I think, again, this suggests sometimes from a CSR perspective, we've somewhat underestimated what society is really interested in. And therefore, as a driver, companies may have a recurring need to demonstrate to society companies' own sociability. And finally, of course, regulation. And again, this is something we found in our research. This can be an impetus to change behaviour, although, as Regina also said, sometimes companies don't so overtly distinguish non-regulatory and regulatory drivers. And we do now have a number of authorities which have introduced light touch requirements for reporting. France, UK, Sweden, Denmark are countries which spring to mind. These actually often follow the best practice of companies. But again, there's an area which might be tweaked a little bit to encourage a greater attention to impact rather than descriptions of policies and of outputs. As you'd expect for academics, we have frameworks. This is a simplified view of the conceptual framework of the study. What's the purpose of a conceptual framework? It's to help us as researchers, albeit from different traditions, studying different aspects of the problem, to have a common language, to know what we're talking about, to put data, if you like, into buckets labelled respectively, response, strategy, performance, for example. It's an idealised model. It's worth just drawing attention to a couple of features. Number one, and it's a responsive model. It's designed to see how companies are responding to their environment, but also you'll see there are feedback loops, and these are characteristics of responsive models. And companies, we're interested in the extent and way in which companies respond to trends, issues and events. We're interested in how they respond to their policy environment. Although it's not captured here, we're also interested in how they respond to pressures within their own organisations, particularly their core stakeholders. Another key feature of the model, again to pick up what's already been said, it distinguishes performance from impact. So the company performance is its outputs, how it implements, and its outcomes at a company level. But we're asking the question, but how does all this stuff impact upon society? How is society changed? Be it from an individual firm to a collection of business activities. And we're looking at how this changes geographically and among sectors. So, as you've gathered, we didn't find very much or as much impact mindfulness or mindedness as we expected. What does that mean? We didn't find as much interest with companies, civil society and governments, as much interest in assessing impact or measuring impact as we might have expected. And to invert a familiar maxim, one wonders whether, if one doesn't measure, whether one can manage. So on the basis of this short overview of what we've been trying to do and a summary of a key finding, I raise these questions which I invite our colleagues to address. Number one, why do they think we might have come up with this finding? They might have insights which we've completely missed in our research, or they might want to elaborate on some of our interpretations. How would business-society relationships change if corporations, regulators, and civil society took a greater interest in impact? What might make for change? And there were 2 points I thought they might address particularly, whether the relationship between the Commission and companies is of any relevance, and also more broadly to question the continuing relevance of CSR in the context of society's interest in bigger questions, the impact of companies more broadly, perhaps best illustrated in terms of climate change and perhaps the financial system in recent years. And finally, will an idealized sense of a corporate impact assessment and measurement meet future societal expectations, or will society be hungry for more, demand more from their corporations? So I'm going to slip back up and join our guests and ask, first of all, Richard to address these questions and perhaps comment more broadly, and they'll each have 10 minutes, and then I'll throw it open. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeremy, and good afternoon, everyone. It is an exciting moment. The biggest ever bit of EU research on corporate social responsibility, and actually that means there's a real responsibility on us to try and get it right at this stage, pulling it together, working out what the conclusions are, and then on behalf of the EU institutions and various Commission colleagues, as well as myself, will be here during the course of the 2 days, actually using it to move on. Well done, ABIS. Well done, all the partners. I do want to pay public credit to DG Research as well. We in the Parliament put in amendments to make sure CSR research was part of the framework programme, but they then had to deliver it with you. And so I am proud, actually, to be here at all of this. And you asked me, Jeremy, to comment on these questions. And I suppose being an elected representative, You know, that is one of the ultimate things about speaking for society. It doesn't mean that I individually get it right on all of these issues, but I suppose I and my colleagues have had this role of trying to steer what Europe does on corporate sustainability, responsibility, accountability, and this is very, very important piece of work for us. In 2007, I said in my report that year we should move from process to outcome. And then in my report of earlier this year, I said we should have a cumulative assessment of the impact of CSR. And so I'm personally very, very pleased that this project is here. And I'm very committed that we take the work that you've done on into the future. I think you make a number of points that I very strongly agree with in terms of we've got to shift away just from the typical research which says that companies are engaging in CSR and just list the numbers of companies, essentially, sometimes the number of initiatives that they have. I think that's very welcome. I think it's very important. Your report, by the way, this is all on the executive summary, and what I've chatted to people with beforehand says it may not be accurate, but let's hope it is. But your report shows that the line of continuing engagement by companies in CSR continues to go up, but of course it's still a minority. And so how we really break through in terms of corporate responsibility remains a challenge for us. And you also, we have to get away from just the business case. You know, my view on the business case is there is a huge amount of research now that supports the business case. It doesn't mean responsibility is always the right short-term outcome if you're a company. But in the long term, I think there's a huge amount of research that shows that it is. Again, your research, as I understand, completely backs that up. One of the things I've been saying in my work in recent years is we don't need more and more research to prove the business case. Either people want to read what's there, understand it, and apply it or not. And so again, moving away just from that approach is something I very strongly support. I do think, I've said in my reports, and I thought reading your research, the fact that we have less well-defined indicators on social and human rights impact for the company is an issue. You know, I think the Commission tried hard in its work on public procurement to begin to address that issue, but found it very difficult in all reality. It's very easy if you can measure tons of carbon, but the minute that you get into issues around diversity in the workforce and so on, often it's quite controversial in some of our member states, let alone child labour. How do you measure child labour? It becomes extremely complicated. But then there are some stuff like employee satisfaction, consumer satisfaction, actually, which are used by companies habitually. So the idea that we can't do it at all, but I don't agree with that, but we can clearly develop many, many more. It is important to say that our friends from DG Enterprise did commission a few years ago now a responsible competitiveness index, and it was an attempt to show that not just companies who engaged in responsibility were more successful, but that whole economies were. And I would like that not to be lost in any follow-up work, because I did find that interesting. And I think the results of that are very important in terms of then shaping European policy. When you talk, like this is an academic audience and an EU level conference, but as a representative who then has to go to his home member state and talk about Europe and the relevance of what we do, you know, I think it's important also in presenting this that we show a really common language that means something to people. So, you know, for me the questions are, how much less climate change is there because all these companies doing all this CSR? How much less inequality is there in Europe? How much less world poverty is there because of all this CSR stuff, right? And I would like us to use that type of language because, in fact, I think that's what people are interested in when we're talking about outcome. On the definition, Regina talked at length about the definition. I don't really believe that many companies, let alone citizens outside, people who lobby in Brussels, which is a very small bubble, care less about the European Commission's definition of CSR. I care about it a lot, and I've tried to influence it a lot.
But let's have a degree of humility about that. The fact that companies aren't wrestling with that definition is not something that surprises me at all. The fact that actually the new definition chimes with practice does interest me. I think it's an extremely interesting finding. And people who know me know I spent many years saying let's get off this false dichotomy of voluntary versus mandatory. And the fact that your research is thrown out that that's rather sensible. And by the way, the new definition chimes with what's being agreed at the world level, for example, the UN Guiding Principles and the ISO 26000 approach is all very, very welcome. But the fact that that isn't then widely understood and talked about across huge numbers of businesses, I think isn't necessarily a huge is a huge problem. I know my 10 minutes is short, so I'll jump over one or two things I was going to say. But I do think in terms of expectations in this panel, no one's mentioned the economic crisis yet. Your research was over the period, I suppose, when the worst winds hit. And I think it is important, as you saw in my report of earlier this year, that if we're actually going to take CSR forward, then actually working out how we do that in relationship to societal responses to the economic crisis is absolutely crucial. You know, there is this huge loss of trust in business. So CSR has to be part of rebuilding that, and we all know the figures on that, the Edelman figures. Now there's the Commission's own research. I think only 34% in Italy think that the companies are doing, act in a responsible way. Two-thirds don't. So dealing with that issue, dealing with the issue, though, equally of those who said there isn't relevance, and partly, Jeremy, you were talking about relevance, but they're all turning up. You're all turning up to this, right? There isn't less activity around CSR from business, let alone other stakeholders, than there was. And I think that's a huge plus that we can use at the moment in terms of relevance. And then there's the whole issue of a sustainable recovery. And I do think, again, you go back to my report of this year, but essentially it was all about saying that we advance CSR at the European level by making this part of the sustainability of the economic recovery we get. So I think there's a lot around the relevance point there. Final sort of concluding remarks in response to your questions. I think that you're finding that to the degree there is an understanding that performance output, let's say, for companies is gently positive with more CSR, although not the main finding of your research, is a welcome one, right? I would like it was even more pronounced than it is, but it is positive and it's not negative. Right, and I think we should say that at this point. I completely endorse what you say about moving to a more impact-orientated approach. Society is more interested in society than it is in any individual corporation. I do think, and I'm literally this week and next working on my input as one of the report opinion writers on the non-financial reporting directive. I do think that what you find in terms of companies have KPIs, but they don't have common ones and would like to have them, again, chimes with what we're trying to do in terms of non-financial reporting. And Jeremy, I think it is important to say we're about to have an EU law, EU-wide. It's not just Sweden and Britain and Denmark. And I invite everyone here to work with me and others to shape that. I'm delighted by the finding on SMEs, which is something I've thought and said for a long time, but it really underlines what I've said. They're more responsible than big business, and what you're saying in this research is that the cumulative impact of the SMEs is probably more responsible than what the large companies do. That's not big anti-large companies, but it's definitely challenging some assumptions that are sometimes made about SMEs. 90% doing it is and improving their performance because of it. If there's a question I'd like to hear an answer to over the course of the 2 days, it is on the global impacts of some of this stuff. It wasn't very much in the upfront presentations. I'm sure it has been part of the research, but if you take the garment sector, which is one of your 5 sectors, to not actually look at the global chain, for example, and that I'm sure you have, but I'd like to hear that, because a lot of my work at the moment isn't just at the European level, it's working on the UN Guiding Principles, on the Global Reporting Initiative, the International Integrated Reporting Council, other stuff at the world level, and I think it is important we look outward across the world, and I haven't quite heard that yet so far, and do appeal to it. And then in terms of the actions, the clearinghouse idea seems very sensible, practical. Can't see why we wouldn't want to do that. Let's work together on that. Saying to the Commission they must include this in their own evaluation of their own policies, very, very good. But quite hard, actually, you know. And to be honest, I'm quite supportive of where the Commission is at the moment. I think they really have made progress. But I think it's a fair challenge. It's a challenge to all of us, not just to the Commission. But talking with ABIS beforehand, I also think, and I know some colleagues from CSR Europe, and Etienne was here in the audience, there is an issue of not constantly researching more and more methodologies, which we've all been quite good at over the years, but then spending some time applying them. And what I see from this and from other work that I know about is that methodologies are there and it's about applying them. And so talking with ABIS, and I'd like to endorse this, the idea that perhaps CSR Europe or another of the multi-stakeholder organisations with whom we work in Europe or worldwide could actually have some form of incubator where this outcome-led approach was something that was actually developed, not researching a new methodology, but applying what we already know and then actually trying to do it and then learn from the results. I think that could be something that I would like to suggest. Thank you very much.
Just in parenthesis, some will share your frustration around the fact that the project doesn't address global impacts. That was simply, if you like, the parameters of the project within which we were operating. Engelbert.
Yes, I would like to try to answer all of your questions. Maybe it works. The first question, why is there so little CIAM? I think it has a lot to do with the complexity, because we do not have only monolinear causals. We have also a lot of multi-causal effects here. And so it's, for instance, if you are thinking there maybe a small or medium enterprise in a village which is really doing good work on anti-discrimination, and if it's in a village, then of course there will be a big impact. But if the people who are working there are coming from the whole region, and not only from that one village, maybe there's a big impact in the village, but a small impact in the region. And it's really hard to measure that. It's easy to say, we think that might be, but if you have a racist environment in some villages around, and it's really hard to say who is promoting and who is stopping the impact. Well, there is an impact, but it's hard to measure it. The only thing you can do, of course, is you go to the outcome and try to state that there might be an impact, but it's not quite clear if the impact is here or is it not. And I think the other problem, Regina, in your definition, that impact should be contributing to social, economic, and environmental welfare. There is a normative thing in the welfare, and it's hard for enterprises to get that welfare thing right. Of course, if you think about managers and especially the persons in SMEs leading that, they might have that welfare thinking personally in itself, and then it works. But if you have if you like to do that with performance indicators, that is complex, and I think we are still in the beginning of a debate here. And I think the second question, it would be great, and I think we have some impact-minded, but it's not enough at the moment. And we need a debate on the corporate impact, and we need the public media for that. It's not possible to have that effect out of the enterprise alone, because if you think, if you remember, the whole debate on CSR has started with public discourse on enterprises, and the business reaction was a good reaction to start with CSR, and I think here we need now a new discourse on the impacts. And then, if that discourse is established, I think a lot will change. And I think also that the clearinghouse idea is a good idea for promoting the standardization of not only CSR indicators. We have a lot of CSR indicators, and each each company is using that one who seems to be better for its own purposes as another one. And we need the standardization here, and not only having such a multitude of indicators, because we need to have the public discourse, and in this discourse, it's not very helpful if each company has its own indicators, and you cannot compare the activities of one firm with that of another one. That's not good for the public. Might be it's good for us researchers because we cannot do a lot of research on it. It's an interesting topic, of course, but we need to have things more simple as they are in the moment, and therefore we also have to try to define the accountability of corporate impact. Somebody is stating, I'm doing such and such a thing, and there's such and such impact. Therefore, I think we need to be a step more radical, and we need an agency for that accountability. Maybe an agency on the European level would be fine, and if there are not the sustainable rating agencies who say that's our job, then I think maybe Eurostat should have a chance to do that work. And I need, on the other hand, we need for the comparison of the business activities, we need a kind of impact statistics on a country level and even on a European level. And therefore, I think that might be a function of Eurostats. Then I think if you have such things established, then we'll have a move in the whole debate, and then the change will become. And of course, I think there are simple impacts. For instance, here in the House, Suez has, of course, big impact on the supply of the society with drinking water, or the society with disposal services. Yeah. But this is cleaning the society, feeding it with drinking water, okay. But we have to go further, because the discourse is further, and so the CSR impact is a good way to bring us further in the having a better understanding of business and society as we have today. And I think this would be a main purpose. And I think if we have the standardization, if we have the clear definition, and if we in research try to reduce the complexity of these causal nets we have at the moment, then CAEM will work here, and then we'll meet the future societal expectations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thirdly, Bruce.
Right. I just wanted to say a little bit about my background, because that's kind of relevant for how the kind of comments I'm going to make. I worked for about 20 years in business, including 10 years at Canon, where I was CSR director at the end. and on the other hand, the NGO perspective. So it feels sometimes a little bit like a Jekyll and Hyde situation where you have very conflicting experiences. And the business case where you know that there always has to be a clearly defined, relevant business case on the one hand, and from the NGO side, realizing that we're not, the things that brought us here are not the ones that are going to solve the problem. We need to make incremental changes won't bring us there. We need to have some major new thinking, which goes beyond what the normal way of working, and that markets fail. I mean, the markets are not necessarily able to address all the different challenges we face. So it involves sometimes a carrot, sometimes a stick, but also sometimes a totally new definition of what the game is. So it's that with that kind of complexity of thinking that I'm here today, but I hope to try and keep it pragmatic and simple in my comments. So in answer to the first question, why so little impact, I think I had 4 reasons. One is just it's hard. It's just really, as soon as you get into the detail, it gets so complex. Measuring 2 companies that do the same thing, just some small differences in their policy can make a huge difference in how you measure things. Do they have people working at home? If so, do you measure the energy that they use at home to cook water for? So how do you compare things becomes really difficult. So I think difficulty, that's the first one. The second thing, and this is from the corporate perspective, it's really difficult to get the level of tied up thinking. It's not inherent to how businesses work. It's contrary in some ways to the policies they've needed to compete in the past. So I'm not saying it's not a good thing and it's not possible, but it's hard. That makes it's difficult to get that kind of tied up thinking. Another thing is that it's often companies don't want to talk about the negative stuff. That's an important factor. If a lot of the communication, talking about metrics, about the actual impacts, it's easier sometimes to talk about what you're doing than to talk about the impacts you're having on society or the environment in particular. And the other thing is that CSR, as in its traditional form, is often too far removed from the core business. And I think that's a really important point. So it needs to be, if you're doing good CSR, then it needs to be really embedded in the business. And a lot of times, it's just some little department under the communications department or public policy department, which is not linked to the core business. And that's one thing that would have to change when you look at impact. So those are the answers to question 1. The question 2, what would business-society relations change with impact-mindedness? I think so, some, but probably not enough. Again, this is partly due to the complexity of the issue. Having the focus on impacts rather than actions would help to avoid some of the smoke and mirrors that you do get with companies sometimes, where companies talk about specific things they've achieved, but and make claims about it, but don't necessarily translate that into the impacts on society, which makes it quite difficult. I think from a climate side, just to address one specific issue, is if you look at a lot of companies, they have their biggest impacts defined in what is called Scope 4, which goes beyond their own impacts to what the consumer user. To give you a very concrete example, so by developing a washing detergent that you can wash at 30 degrees means that the consumers can save energy by using this detergent, which doesn't take as much work. Now, who gets to claim that? Is it the consumer? Is it the people who develop the washing machines? Is it the manufacturer of the washing detergent? And that's what part of the complexity which comes out of this focus on impact. But I mean, ultimately, and that's the NGO hat on right now, that's where we need to get to, because with all of and that's, I think, the thing that was, as Richard was saying earlier, that the key thing is with the current actions that we're taking now, we're not getting there. And it really needs to be to look at these impacts and what actually are we achieving in terms of getting closer to reducing climate change and reversing it if possible. So those are the, regarding question 2, those are the most important points I wanted to raise. Would business-society relations change if we focus more on impact? No, sorry, that's 2. Sorry about that. What would drive change? I think societal pressure is an important one. And looking outside of Europe, if you look at China now, the fact that their air is so polluted now that they've just recently last week banned building of coal-fired power plants in certain regions. And that's because I think they're quite worried about some sort of potential revolution with people just being fed up with not having clean air to breathe, people dying from that, and even the other effects which are related to that. So I think that will be a key driver. I think also new thinking will be important. So within companies, the shift away from just a isolated CSR department to moving it into the business is an important thing. Does that make CSR irrelevant for the future? No, I don't think so, because you still will need a helmsman, so someone who sort of keeps an eye on all of the different aspects and makes sure it's heading in the right direction and ensuring that tied up thinking within companies. You see it also a lot in other business drivers which are coming out of CSR. So if you look at chocolate, for example, because of some of the sustainability challenges that are faced in the cocoa production, for example, that there's a realization that there may be real challenges for the business for their existence unless these issues are addressed. And so that's one thing that's happening. Same thing with electronics. If you look at rare earth issues or this continued success of the business is very much linked to some of these sustainability challenges and impacts. And so that's where companies really wake up and start to listen to what's going on. So, and the last question about will CIM, do we pronounce that CIM or CIAM or? CIM, okay, meet further societal expectations. I think it's a start. I think the thing about the blur of scope 4, for example, is going to make it hard, but just because it's hard doesn't mean it's not worth going for, and I think that's where we need to be. If we look at we really do need to achieve impact, and unless we start measuring it, it's not going to really happen. So those were my starting points. I have a couple things, but maybe they'll come up later.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you all three for engaging with us and with the challenge we've set, for shedding some light on its context and some of the further difficulties, but also warming to the challenge. We now have some time for discussion from the floor, so if you wave your hand at me, I can take a question, or a comment, or an additional point. Yeah, could you just tell us who you are, please? And there's a microphone on its way.
I wanted to get into the global aspects a little bit here. If we want as Europe to see impact changing in CSR, what can we do to secure more cooperation with, we mentioned China, but maybe the US would be interesting because there's a trade agreement in the makes with the US currently. And are we, I'm speaking with Lisa here, embedding trade agreement, CSR into trade agreements or not? Are we in a capacity to do so practically? Do we have enough leverage? Because if we are concerned about this, clearly we have to talk to our partners. You mentioned China, and China is going to substitute probably coal for nuclear. Is that really what we want from a European perspective? Fewer people are going to die in China, and there's going to be less pollution, but so some of these concrete issues, perhaps.
You want to continue?
Right. And
Yeah.
This is Lisa Chase, also from the Harvard Business School, and Vincent was, I think, alluding to what I believe is a proposed piece of legislation on requiring that corporations who are trading into or out of the EU specify within their trade agreements their corporate social responsibility standards related to the environment and social welfare policies. And I'm very curious to hear if anyone may be able to speak to the status of that. I believe, I could be mistaken, but I believe it had been voted on in Parliament, possibly referred back to the European Commission for revision. So I think we're both very, very interested in hearing what the status might be, because the implications both for CSR policy and then internationally, economically and politically are quite significant.
Thank you. I'll take one more and then I'll pass it back to the panel. No, I'll pass it straight back to the panel. Richard, would you deal with the legislative question around trade agreements and their potential? And then perhaps Engelbert and Bruce could address the wider global challenges.
Lisa, you never quite know when some idea comes out of Brussels where it's come from, and then it sort of goes round, and then people assume it's going to happen. And then if you come from my country, Great Britain, the newspapers all say it's the most terrible thing ever and Britain should leave the European Union. And actually what it was a Commission official who's a desk officer on the phone to somebody like you or me, just say, well, this is something we could perhaps look at. And then, you know, there are huge outcomes from that when it was never necessarily more than a good idea or a bad idea at some point. There's a lot that's going on around that. The European Parliament itself had a report on trade and CSR that my French colleague Alain Dessier did a very good job on, and I inputted to, and came up with some good stuff. I've consistently been talking about utilising trade agreements to advance CSR. I went to a meeting in the States with American businesses and the American Trade Department and said that, and they fell down dead. They thought it was so bad. So trying to get international support for that might be harmful. But I would want to give credit to the Commission's DG Trade, who have begun to put it in trade agreements, including the Colombia-Peru one, and one of the ones, I think it's Korea, put it in. It's only referencing it. And in fact, that's why I said to our American friends, all we're doing is referencing it. We're not making it conditional or contingent on anything. It's not a sort of disguised trade protectionism. It's a promotional tool. And I still stand absolutely by us doing it. I know there's also, in the context of the EU-US trade agreement, there's been some stuff in the press about this stuff, and clearly people are talking about it in the context of that agreement. But I personally welcome the fact that we use the trade agenda to advance CSR, as long as it's done genuinely to increase investment, increase trade, but with good standards for that trade and investment, not as disguised protectionism to reduce trade and to reduce investment. And there are some who would do that, and we have to make sure we're always on the right side of the argument.
It's probably worth just noting that there has sort of been a bottom-up alternative version of this through CSR initiatives between companies and NGOs and other civil society arrangements to establish standards like in the marine sourcing, timber sourcing. So that's, in a sense, a CSR initiative. And then in a number of European countries, these standards have been adopted by governments for their public procurement. So it's a sort of a bottom-up approach. Engelbert.
Sorry.
No. Bruce.
You know, just, I think probably there may be some possibilities to make use of the fact that there is increasing interest among some of the key players like China and US and these things to try and reach some agreement. Part of it could be trade. I think that trade is a great way of doing it if it's done properly. But you do have some risks there as well, because you don't always know what you get ultimately when you pass the legislations, and it can have very different effects than you expect. So that makes it difficult. I think innovation will also be another key area where there's a possibility to really make a difference. So,
Richard just wants to have a supplementary.
Very briefly on the first point, I know most of you will know this, but it's very important to say that the international architecture on corporate responsibility has and is changing. And so there are hooks to do this. And, you know, I referred to the guiding principles, but the buy-in on the guiding principles is very, very high amongst the large companies. And it's playing a very influential role, I think, worldwide. The OECD guidelines update, again, is a very, very significant step forward. And many people say that it might become the global architecture at some future point, perhaps being hived off from the OECD and becoming freestanding. But already a third of the signatories to it are non-OECD countries. And then a lot was achieved at Rio plus 20. I accept a lot wasn't, WWF would say that, but there's now a lot of work on the 2015 UN Millennium Development Goals throughput on what can be done in that for corporate accountability, responsibility and reporting. And so these aren't just ideas that we're talking about in a conference in Brussels. There are very serious international negotiations with countries and businesses about how we then translate this at the global level. I have a privilege of playing a part in some of that, and it is very important that in a sort of meeting like this one, that in terms of then applying the results, that you see the opportunities that there are using those mechanisms to do so, not just in Europe, but worldwide.
Any other comments or questions? Well, in that case, I'm not going to get any further between you and coffee. I've just to pull together a few points that were made today, which I thought were very, very helpful. The imperative around this in regard to the trust question. I think also the need for communicable, simple ways of talking about this came through very nicely. It occurs to me, unusual for an Englishman to quote a French person, I think it was President Sarkozy who observed that it's curious how the financial modelers could come up with ways of rewarding those in the financial businesses for their performance, when their performance is manifestly a reflection of the people in the organization and a world outside which also affects prices. But there we are, they've seemed to have come up with something which they'll all live by, so perhaps we can be encouraged by that. Please enjoy your coffee and come back refreshed for our next session. Thank you again.